Four Spheres of Knowledge Creation. The Causal Principles by René Holmbjerg Bøtker. Chapter 12. Fields. A collection of actualized objects is a set, and the objects in a set are delineated by the shared boundaries that emerges in the actualization process. The shared boundaries are an instantaneous representation of the interaction that exists between two potential objects. A collection of these interactions represents a field. A collection of shared boundaries is a field, which represents the possibilities for interaction and exchange of property between actualized objects in a set. Any interaction is predicated on the pre-established harmony, which is noumenal and undifferentiated. As such, the pre-established harmony itself is a field, which represents any possible interaction. The pre-established harmony ensures that the property of potential objects will always be compatible and subject to interaction. Potential objects can only interact if the potential for interaction is enabled by the pre-established harmony. The shared boundaries in a set represents a network of interactions, which exist as a particular differentiated representation of the infinite, undifferentiated pre-established harmony. The shared boundaries as a field are both subject to and a representation of the pre-established harmony. A field that is an analog representation of the pre-established harmony represents any possible interaction in a set by presenting any possible shared boundaries through which objects in a set can be delineated and defined. Where an interaction concerns the definition of the property in an actualized object, a field concerns the ability of the object to engage in the actualization process and represent property through the shared boundaries that exist in a set. The actualization process is a process of interaction, and the ability to interact is the ability to either express or perceive in the exchange of property, which takes place in the actualization process. This ability is the ability to perform an expressive or perceptive representation of property. A field concerns the ability to engage in either expressive or perceptive representations of property. This means that a field will always have a perspective, which can be either expressive or perceptive. The representation of property from an expressive perspective concerns the ability of an object to express the property within it. The representation of property from a perceptive perspective concerns the ability to perceive and recognize the expression of another object in the noumenal property of itself. A field of interactions can be composed of either expressive or perceptive representations. Constitutive and governing fields. A constitutive field concerns the structures of a set through which the set emerges. The expressive interactions in a set constitutes the field, and therefore a collection of expressive interactions is a constitutive field. A constitutive field is a representation of the structures of boundaries within a set that can enable the actualization of an object through interactions. A governing field concerns the structures of a set through which interactions in a set exists. The perceptive interactions in a field governs the ability of recognition, and therefore a collection of perceptions is a governing field. A governing field is a representation of the structures of boundaries within a set that has been actualized through interactions. As such, it can be said that fields composed of expressive interactions constitutes a set, while fields composed of perceptive interactions governs a set. Spatial fields. The expression of property of an object in the spatial dimension is a phenomenal representation, which is an analog to the noumenal world. The expression of property constitutes the phenomenal representation of an object. A collection of expressions is a constitutive field. A spatial constitutive field is subject to and a representation of the pre-established harmony, which exists in the noumenal world. A spatial constitutive field is analog to the principles of interaction, which exists as the pre-established harmony in the noumenal world. A spatial constitutive field represents any possible phenomenal expression in the spatial dimension as an analog representation of the pre-established harmony. A spatial governing field enables the perceiving objects in the spatial dimension to recognize the expressions of other objects. The perceptions of an object in the spatial dimension are recognitions of the phenomenal expressions by other objects. A spatial governing field is an analog to the interactions in the phenomenal world. As the phenomenal world is a finite differentiated representation of the noumenal world, the perceptions, which recognizes property, governs the possibilities for interaction. A governing spatial field is therefore a representation of a finite harmony between objects that exists as the ability to recognize from the perspective of the perceiving object. It is a representation of a collection of interactions between the phenomenal expressions subjected to the ability of recognition by the perceiving objects in the set. A spatial governing field therefore represents the abilities of recognition by the objects in a set. Temporal fields. A temporal constitutive field enables any possible phenomenal expression which occur in the temporal dimension. The expression of an object in the temporal dimension is a phenomenal representation that is mediated through the perceptive phenomenal recognition of other representations of an object. A temporal constitutive field is subject to and a representation of the capabilities of phenomenal recognition as a mediating harmony determined by the expression of recognized objects in a set. A temporal constitutive field is an analog to the expression of phenomenal recognition in a set, and is a particular representation of property mediated through the noumenal property of the perceiving object. A temporal governing field enables the perceptions in the temporal dimension. The temporal dimension exists as multiple spatial representations of an object. The spatial representations exist as perceived property, which represents the temporal dimension. The perception from objects in a set in the temporal dimension is a noumenal representation of the property of the perceiving objects. A temporal governing field is therefore an analog to the possibilities of interaction in the noumenal world. A temporal governing field is therefore an immediate representation of the pre-established harmony.